black woman told she can't afford a first-class ticket later, she purchases the entire airline. As the polished mahogany doors of the Summit Airlines boardroom swung open, Nia Thompson stepped inside, her silhouette framed against the glass walls of the Atlanta skyline. The room fell silent, every executive's gaze locked on her. Charles Rutherford, the grizzled CEO, sat at the head of the table. "I warned you," she said, her voice as sharp as a blade. "You told me I didn't belong in first class. Now I own the whole airline." The room erupted. Board members whispered, eyes darting between Nia and Charles. His face flushed red, veins bulging as he shot to his feet. "You think you can just walk in here and take over? I built this empire," he roared. Nia remained unflinching. "You built it on exclusion. I'll rebuild it on equality." She turned to the board. "Summit Airlines is now Apex Air, first-class treatment. For everyone." Applause thundered through the room. Charles slumped back into his chair, defeated. Nia held his gaze, a quiet triumph glowing in her eyes. This wasn't just her victory. It was a win for every voice silenced, every dream deferred. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, drop a 1 in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales of justice and redemption. Let's keep the conversation going. Your voice matters. The air in Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport buzzed with the restless hum of 1,000 lives colliding. Suitcases clattering, voices overlapping, and the sharp ping of gate announcements slicing through the chaos. Under the glare of flickering fluorescent lights, Nia Thompson cut through the crowd like a blade, her heels clicking with purpose against the scuffed tile floor. At 42, she carried herself with the quiet authority of a woman who'd built a $3 billion tech empire from nothing. Apex Innovations, a name whispered in boardrooms and feared by competitors. Her tailored blazer hugged her frame, and her steely gaze locked on the Summit Airlines counter ahead. In her hand, she clutched a first-class ticket to Dallas, the crisp paper a badge of her hard-earned place in the world. She reached the counter, setting her briefcase down with a soft thud, and slid the ticket toward the agent. Lisa Carter, 35, perched behind the desk, her pinched face framed by a tight blonde bun. Her eyes flicked up from her screen, meeting Nia's with a cold, appraising stare. The smirk that curled Lisa's lips was subtle but unmistakable. A silent judgment that hit Nia like a slap. "I'm sorry, Ms. Thompson," Lisa drawled, her voice thick with condescension. "First class is full. Premium economy suits you better." She pushed the ticket back across the counter, her manicured fingers lingering on it as if daring Nia to argue. Nia's chest tightened, a familiar heat rising in her throat. She straightened, her voice low and steady. "I confirmed seat 1B last night. Check again." Lisa's smirk widened, her fingers tapping lazily on the keyboard. "System says it's taken. Nothing I can do." Before Nia could respond, a shadow loomed beside her. Tom Harris, 50, a white businessman in a crumpled suit, swaying slightly and reeking of bourbon. He tossed his boarding pass onto the counter with a sloppy grin. "First class, sweetheart," he slurred. Lisa's demeanor flipped like a switch. Her smile brightened, and she nodded eagerly. "Of course, Mr. Harris. Right this way." She handed him a boarding pass, winking as he staggered off toward the gate. Nia stood frozen, the ticket trembling in her grip as the crowd around her shifted. Some snickered behind their hands, others turned away, pretending not to see. The humiliation burned through her like wildfire. Her fists clenched, nails biting into her palms as decades of slights roared back. Every "you don't belong" glance, every whispered doubt, every door slammed in her face. She'd clawed her way to the top, built Apex from a dream in her childhood bedroom, and still, here she was, reduced to a stereotype by a smug gatekeeper in a polyester vest. "This isn't just a seat," she muttered under her breath, her voice quaking with rage and resolve. "It's a battlefield." Lisa, oblivious, adjusted her name tag with a self-satisfied flick, her smugness a thin veil over her own fragility. A woman clinging to the petty power of a crumbling airline, unaware of the storm she'd just unleashed. A small voice broke the tension, a child no older than 6 tugging at her mother's sleeve nearby. "Mommy, why'd she get pushed back?" The question rang out, sharp and innocent, slicing through the murmur of the terminal. Heads turned, eyes darting between Nia and Lisa, amplifying the sting of her public shame. Nia's jaw tightened, her pulse hammering in her ears. She opened her mouth to demand a supervisor, but Lisa waved a hand dismissively. "Already checked with him. System glitch, ma'am. Take it or leave it." The supervisor, a balding man with a clipboard, appeared behind Lisa, shrugging as if Nia's anger was a minor inconvenience. "Nothing we can do," he said, his tone flat and final. Nia snatched her ticket back, her heart pounding like a war drum. She turned on her heel, storming toward the gate, the crowd parting before her like water before a ship. As she reached premium economy, she stopped, staring at the curtains separating her from first class, a flimsy barrier that felt like a wall of steel. Her breath hitched, and she whispered to herself, "They'll pay." It wasn't just a promise. It was a vow carved into her soul, a fire that would burn until Summit Airlines knelt at her feet. Rain hammered the plane's windows, streaking the glass like jagged scars as turbulence jolted the cabin. Nia Thompson sat rigid in her premium economy seat, the drone of engines swallowed by the storm raging outside, and the one boiling within her. Beside her, a passenger snored, his head lolling against the seat, oblivious to the fire in her eyes. She stared at the first-class curtain ahead, its faded blue fabric swaying with each shudder of the plane, a flimsy divide that felt like a fortress wall. Her reflection glared back from the window. Lips pressed tight, brows furrowed, a mask of fury and unshakable determination. Her phone glowed in her lap as she typed a message to Marcus Evans, her 48-year-old CFO and the steadiest anchor in her life. "Cancel everything, we're taking Summit Airlines down, or taking it over." Her fingers danced across the screen, drafting a takeover plan with ferocious speed. Names, numbers, timelines spilling out as lightning split the sky, its electric flash mirroring the charge surging through her veins. This wasn't a whim. It was a war cry born in the ashes of that airport humiliation, a vow to turn their smug dismissal into her victory. Summit wouldn't just pay, they'd kneel. "I'm done being invisible," she hissed under her breath, the words raw and jagged as tears stung her eyes. Her chest heaved with the weight of it all. Every sidelong glance, every door slammed shut, every time she'd been told she didn't belong. She saw her father's face, his hands rough from years of scrubbing floors, his voice steady in her memory. "They'll push you down, Nia. Rise anyway." This wasn't just her fight. It was for every black face brushed aside, every dream crushed under the heel of someone else's prejudice. Her tears fell, hot and silent, but her resolve hardened like iron. The plane lurched hard, a tray crashing to the floor as passengers gasped and gripped their armrests. Nia didn't flinch. "This storm's nothing compared to what's coming," she whispered, her voice swallowed by the thunder. Her mind churned. Could this rage blind her, spiraling into chaos? Or would it fuel her triumph, lifting her above their wreckage? She closed her eyes, the answer pulsing like a heartbeat. She'd rise, and they'd fall. The glass walls of Apex Innovations' Atlanta headquarters glowed against the night, a sleek fortress cutting through the dark. Inside, the war room was a battlefield, papers strewn across a long table, coffee cups stacked like fallen soldiers, the printer's hum a steady drumbeat. Nia stood at the helm, her blazer tossed aside, sleeves rolled up as she scrolled through a laptop screen. Marcus paced beside her, his salt and pepper hair catching the faint light, his broad frame taut with barely contained fury. The data hit like a fist. Summit's stock had tanked 38% in a year, their debt a strangling vine, and their discrimination complaints towered 23% above the industry average. Marcus slammed his fist down, his voice a growl that rattled the room. "This isn't a company, Nia. It's a damn plantation. Nia's eyes flared as she dug deeper, uncovering 4 lawsuits buried under NDAs, each one a dagger to her heart. They silenced us, Marcus, she said, her voice splintering with anguish. My God, they silenced us. She clicked a file, her breath hitching as stories flooded the screen. Black passengers rerouted, employees sacked for daring to speak, a pattern etched into Summit's bones. Marcus stopped, gripping the table's edge. I've felt that boot on my neck too, he said, his deep voice trembling with a pain that mirrored hers. Every job I fought for, every room I walked into, they saw my skin first. Let's crush them. Nia nodded, her grief sharpening into cold precision. No more shadows, she vowed, her soul howling for justice as she traced the numbers, each one a brick in the wall she'd topple. A light bulb flickered overhead, buzzing like a trapped fly, casting jagged shadows across the room. Nia paused, her cursor hovering over a leaked memo tucked in an employee's cloud drive. Her pulse quickened as she read, Directive X, preserve the premium image. It was cryptic, veiled, but unwritten edict from Summit's CEO to keep black passengers out of first class. She gasped. This goes all the way up. Marcus leaned in, his jaw tight. That's our weapon, he said. Nia's lips curled into a fierce, grim smile. The rot ran deeper than she'd imagined, and she'd use it to bring them down. The Dallas skyline sparkled beyond the towering windows of Carter Investments, but inside the boardroom, the air was heavy with cigar smoke and tension. Nia sat at a polished mahogany table, her posture a steel rod as she faced Evelyn Carter. She laid out her plan. $8 billion locked in, $5 billion from Apex reserves, $3 billion from partners, splitting Summit's corpse between them. Horizon would claim the international routes. Apex would seize the domestic ops. Evelyn slammed her cane down, the crack echoing like a gunshot. I've watched this poison fester for decades, she said, her voice a low snarl. 40 years back, they bumped me from first class for a white guy in a cheap suit. Said he needed the legroom. I'm in. Her hands shook with the rage she'd carried, a scar that matched Nia's fresh wound. Daniel shifted, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm. Bold move, Thompson, he said, his tone cool and guarded. But you're playing with fire. Summit's a wreck. Why risk it? Nia leaned in, her eyes piercing his, because it's profitable, Pierce, and because it's right. His facade slipped, unease with Summit's racism flickering through. It's bad business, not just bad morals, he muttered, then nodded. I'm in for the numbers. Nia's passion lit them up, tears spilling as she cried. This is our fight. Thunder rolled outside, rattling the windows as Nia stretched out her hand. Evelyn's grip was iron. Daniel's was hesitant but firm. Lightning flared, framing Nia's fierce silhouette against the glass, a warrior forging a pact in a storm's heart. Yet a shadow lingered in her mind. Could these allies weather the war, or would betrayal creep in? She shoved the doubt down, her resolve a blazing flame. Summit would fall, with or without them. Rain lashed the windows of the shadowy Atlanta restaurant, casting jagged reflections across the private room where Nia sat with 15 former Summit employees. Their faces bore the weight of years, lines of exhaustion, eyes dim with silenced pain. Keisha Brooks, 40, a former manager with braids tumbling down her back, sat nearest, her hands quivering as she slid a USB drive across the table. They'll destroy me for this, she whispered, her voice faint against the storm's roar. Nia plugged it in, her breath catching as emails loaded. Proof of Directive X. Charles Rutherford's order to maintain demographic balance in first class. She stood, her voice a thunderclap that shook the walls. Your silence ends now. Keisha's sob broke free, her words tumbling out like a flood. I hid this for years. My kids went hungry because I wouldn't fight. Nia's heart cracked open, her own voice a guttural cry. "You're not alone anymore." The others nodded. Jerome, passed over for promotions. Asia, punished for her hair. Michael, fired for speaking out. Their anguish a tidal wave fueling her crusade. She offered a $50 million fund, her eyes blazing. "We'll rebuild what they broke." Keisha's guilt was a raw wound. "I let them erase us," she said, her hands trembling as she clutched Nia's arm. "I heard Charles laugh about it, said we didn't fit the brand." Nia's fury surged, but she softened, squeezing Keisha's hand. "You're my strength now." Outside, a figure lingered in the shadows, rain-soaked and watching. Someone knew Keisha had talked. Nia didn't notice, her focus locked on the screen as one email stood out. Charles had personally ordered Keisha's firing after she challenged Directive X, framing her as disruptive. Nia snarled. "He's a coward, and he's mine." The glass walls of Apex Innovations' Atlanta headquarters shimmered against the night sky, a sleek fortress standing defiant in the dark. Inside, the war room was a chaos of purpose. Papers littered the long table like fallen leaves, coffee cups stacked haphazardly like relics of a long fight, the printer's steady hum a quiet heartbeat beneath the tension. Nia stood at the center, her blazer flung over a chair, sleeves shoved up as she hunched over a laptop, her fingers hovering above the key. Marcus Evans paced behind her, his salt and pepper hair glinting under the dim lights, his broad shoulders tight with a fury that matched her own. The screen glowed with Summit Airline's secrets, each line a wound laid bare. The stock had plunged 38% in a year, a freefall that left them gasping. Their debt loomed like a guillotine, ready to drop, and the discrimination complaints, 23% higher than any rival, painted a picture so ugly Marcus couldn't hold it in. He slammed his fist on the table, the thud echoing like a gunshot, his voice a raw bellow that shook the walls. "This isn't a company, Nia. It's a damn plantation." Coffee sloshed over the rim of a cup, pooling dark and bitter on the wood. Nia's eyes blazed as she scrolled deeper, her breath catching as 4 lawsuits flickered into view, each one smothered under NDAs, silent screams from people like her. "They silenced us, Marcus," she said, her voice cracking under the weight of it. "My God, they silenced us." Her fingers trembled as she clicked, stories spilling out. Black passengers shunted aside, employees buried for daring to speak. A legacy of exclusion stitched into Summit's core. Marcus stopped pacing, his hands gripping the table's edge until his knuckles whitened. "I've felt that boot on my neck too," he said, his deep voice quivering with a pain that ran bone deep. "Every job I scratched for, every room I walked into, they saw my skin before my worth. I'd sit in meetings, Nia, watching white boys half my age get the nods I earned. Let's crush them." His eyes locked with hers, a shared fire burning through the years between them. 2 black kids from nowhere who'd built something unstoppable, now facing a beast they both knew too well. Nia nodded, her grief sharpening into a cold, surgical precision. "No more shadows," she vowed, her soul howling for justice as she traced the data with a fingertip. Each number a brick in the wall she'd tear down. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. It was for her father's hunched back, her mother's quiet prayers, every soul Summit had tried to erase. A light bulb overhead flickered, buzzing like a trapped wasp, casting eerie shadows that danced across the room. Nia paused, her cursor lingering over a file tucked deep in an employee's cloud drive. A leaked memo, its edges rough like it'd been scanned in haste. Her pulse quickened as she opened it, the words leaping out. Directive X. Preserve the premium image. It was vague, cloaked in corporate jargon, but the intent hit her like a slap. An unwritten rule from Summit's CEO to keep black passengers out of first class, to polish their image with exclusion. She gasped, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "This goes all the way up?" Marcus leaned over her shoulder, his jaw tightening as he read. "That's our weapon," he said, his voice low and lethal. Nia's lips curled into a fierce, grim smile, her mind racing, The rot wasn't just in the numbers, it was in the bones of Summit's leadership, a conspiracy she'd rip open with her bare hands. They'd built their empire on her people's backs, and she'd make them choke on every lie. The Dallas skyline glittered beyond the towering windows of Carter Investments, a constellation of lights piercing the dusk, but inside the boardroom, the air hung thick with cigar smoke and unspoken stakes. Nia Thompson sat at the head of a polished mahogany table, her spine straight as a blade, her dark eyes cutting through the haze. Across from her, Evelyn Carter, 70, leaned forward, her silver hair catching the dim glow of a chandelier, her hazel eyes burning with a fire that belied her age. Beside her lounged Daniel Pierce, 52, Horizon Airways CEO, his crisp suit and sharper gaze marking him as a man who weighed every word like a coin. Nia's voice rang out, fierce and unshakable, filling the room like a storm breaking loose. "They spit on us, Evelyn. I'll make them choke on it." She laid her plan bare. $8 billion locked and loaded, $5 billion from Apex Innovations' war chest, $3 billion from partners itching to see Summit bleed. The split was clean. Horizon would snatch the international routes, Apex would claim the domestic operations, carving up Summit like a Thanksgiving turkey. She slapped a folder onto the table, the thud punctuating her words. "We've got the cash, the data, and the will. Summit's vulnerable, stocks down, debts crushing them, and their racism's a festering wound. We strike now." Evelyn's cane slammed down, the crack splitting the smoky silence like a gunshot. "I've watched this poison fester for decades," she said, her voice a low, guttural snarl. 40 years ago, they bumped me from first class for a white man in a cheap suit, said he needed the legroom. I've waited too long for this. I'm in." Her gnarled hands gripped the cane, steadying the tremble of a rage she'd nursed through years of being dismissed. Daniel shifted in his chair, his fingers drumming a restless beat on the table's edge. "Bold move, Thompson," he said, his tone cool and measured, like a man sizing up a poker hand. "But you're playing with fire. Summit's a mess. Why risk your empire on it?" Nia leaned in, her gaze locking onto his, unyielding. "Because it's profitable, Pierce, and because it's right. Their rot's costing them. Customers, trust, millions. We fix that, we win big." He hesitated, his eyes flickering with unease. Not at her plan, but at Summit's ugliness, a stain he'd sidestepped too long. "It's bad business, not just bad morals," he muttered, almost to himself, then nodded sharply. "I'm in. For the numbers." His agreement was reluctant, a pragmatist bending under the weight of her conviction. Evelyn's wrath was a living thing, pulsing in the air. "I'm tired of being a ghost in their game," she snapped, her hands shaking as they betrayed decades of suppressed fury. Every slight, every time she'd been overlooked, pouring out in that moment. Daniel's detachment cracked, his muttered concession revealing a man who'd seen Summit's bias but never fought it, a quiet shame he masked with profit talk. Nia's passion blazed through them all, her voice breaking as tears slipped down her cheeks. "This is our fight," she cried, her fists clenching as the weight of her airport shame, her father's lessons, and every silenced voice fueled her. She was a spark, and they caught fire. Evelyn's vengeance, Daniel's calculation, her own righteous fury weaving them into a fragile, fierce alliance. Thunder rumbled outside, a low growl shaking the windows as Nia stretched out her hand. Evelyn's grip was iron, her knuckles white with resolve. Daniel's was firm but tentative, a man still half in shadow. Lightning flashed, bathing the room in stark white, illuminating Nia's fierce silhouette against the glass. A warrior sealing a pact in the heart of a brewing storm. Her heart pounded as their hands met, a current of power surging between them, but a shadow flickered in her mind, a whisper of doubt cutting through the triumph. Could these allies withstand the war she'd unleashed, or would betrayal lurk in their ranks, waiting to strike? She pushed it down, her resolve a roaring flame. Summit would fall, with them or over their broken trust. She'd make sure of it. Rain lashed the windows of the shadowy Atlanta restaurant, streaking the glass with jagged trails that mirrored the tension inside. The private room was a cocoon of dim light and hushed voices, the air thick with the weight of secrets about to break free. Nia Thompson sat at a long table, her eyes scanning the 15 former Summit Airlines employees gathered around her. Their faces etched with lines of exhaustion, their gazes hollow with years of buried pain. At her side, Keisha Brooks, 40, a former manager with braids cascading over her shoulders, fidgeted with her hands, her breath shallow. She slid a USB drive across the scarred wood, her whisper barely cutting through the storm's roar outside. "They'll destroy me for this." Nia's fingers closed around the drive, her pulse quickening as she plugged it into her laptop. The screen flickered to life, emails spilling out like blood from a wound, confirmation of Directive X, Charles Rutherford's cold command to maintain demographic balance in first class. Her stomach twisted as she read the words, each one a dagger proving what she'd feared. Summit's CEO, a 58-year-old titan with a Navy past, had built his empire on exclusion. She stood, her chair scraping back, her voice a roar that shook the walls. "Your silence ends now!" The room jolted, eyes widening as her words hit home. Keisha's sob broke the silence, raw and ragged. "I hid this for years. My kids went hungry because I wouldn't fight back." Her hands clutched the table's edge, tears streaming as she bared the cost of her fear. Nights of skipped meals, a life dimmed by Summit's shadow. Nia slammed her fist down, offering a lifeline. $50 million. I'm funding it. We'll rebuild what they broke. Keisha's guilt was a gaping wound, her voice trembling as it poured out. "I let them erase us," she said, her hands shaking as she reached for Nia's arm, clinging like a lifeline. "I heard Charles laugh about it in his office, said we didn't fit the brand. I should have screamed then, but I just signed their damned NDA." Her eyes, red and pleading, locked with Nia's, handing over her truth like a fragile gift. Nia's heart cracked open, her own voice a guttural cry that echoed off the walls. "You're not alone anymore." The others stirred. Jerome's quiet nod, his promotions stolen. Asia's clenched fists, her hair a rebellion they'd punished. Michael's hunched shoulders fired for daring to speak. Their collective anguish swelled, a tidal wave of grief and fury that fueled Nia's crusade. She squeezed Keisha's hand, her resolve steeling. "We're taking them down, together." Outside, rain blurred the world, but a figure lingered in the shadows beyond the glass, rain-soaked and still. Someone watching. Someone who knew Keisha had talked. The storm masked their presence, a silent threat Nia didn't see, as her focus stayed riveted on the screen. She scrolled, her breath hitching as one email stood out. Charles's own words, ordering Keisha's firing after she dared question Directive X. He'd framed her as disruptive, a coward's move to bury her defiance. Nia's snarl cut through the room, low and lethal. "He's a coward, and he's mine." Her eyes blazed, the USB drive a loaded gun in her hand. Charles had drawn the battle lines, but she'd fire the first shot, and it'd be the one to end him. The storm battered Summit Airlines' Dallas headquarters, rain hammering the glass tower until it trembled under the onslaught. Inside, the boardroom crackled with tension, a sleek expanse of steel and wood framed by floor-to-ceiling windows that rattled with each gust. Nia Thompson stormed through the double doors, her heels striking the floor like war drums. Marcus Evans and a team of lawyers flanking her like a phalanx. The directors sat around a gleaming table, their faces a gallery of unease. Some pale, some scowling, all braced for the reckoning. At the head, Charles Rutherford loomed, a grizzled ex-Navy pilot at 58, his steel-gray hair slicked back, his broad frame taut with defiance. Nia stopped dead center, slamming the USB drive onto the table, her voice a thunderclap that shook the room. "You built an empire on our backs. Now it's ours." She flicked on a projector, the screen flaring to life with Directive X's damning emails. Charles's own words ordering staff to maintain demographic balance in first class, a sanitized way of saying keep them out. The room erupted, gasps and murmurs colliding as Charles leapt to his feet, his face flushing purple with rage. "You're a liar with a grudge," he bellowed, his voice a cannon blast, veins bulging in his neck as he jabbed a finger at her. Nia didn't flinch, her eyes locked on his. "This is your signature, Charles. Your orders. Your hate." Evelyn Carter, 70, her silver hair glinting under the lights, slammed the table with her fist, her cane clattering to the floor. "You're the liar, Charles. I've seen your filth," she snapped, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. Nia held up a tablet, revealing the shareholder tally. 42% locked in her favor. "Vote now," she commanded. Evelyn took the lead, her gaze searing. "All in favor of the takeover." 9 hands rose. A landslide. Charles and 2 loyalists glowered, outmatched. His roar shook the walls. "I'll burn this down before you take it." He lunged for the door, his exit a desperate charge. Charles's fury was a wildfire, unhinged and primal. "I earned this," he screamed as he spun back, his fists clenched, spittle flying. "You don't belong here." The words landed like blows, his racism a festering wound ripped open for all to see. Decades of entitlement spilling out in a single, ugly burst. Nia's triumph surged, but it was bittersweet, her chest tightening as tears streamed down her face. She whispered, barely audible over the storm. "For every one of us you crushed." Her mind flashed to her father's tired eyes, Keisha's trembling hands, every soul Summit had ground down. Her victory a fragile balm for their scars. Evelyn's vindication burned bright, her voice a triumphant hiss as she glared at Charles's retreating back. "Finally, you bastard!" Her hands shook with the release of 40 years' worth of fury. A woman who'd borne the same slights, now standing tall in their shared win. Mid-meeting, Marcus thrust a phone forward, his voice urgent. "Listen to this." A secret recording crackled through the speakers. Charles's voice, slurred and smug from a private club months ago. "They don't fit the image. Keep 'em out of first class. Makes the VIPs comfy." He laughed, a cruel, guttural sound that made the board gasp, chairs scraping as the truth sank in. Nia's eyes widened, her breath catching. This wasn't just proof, it was a guillotine. "You recorded that?" she asked, stunned. Marcus nodded grimly. "A bartender slipped it to us. Charles stiffed him one too many times." The room tilted, directors exchanging horrified glances as the vote cemented. Charles's doom was sealed, his own words, the noose around his neck. Glass shattered as Charles, halfway to the door, grabbed a chair and hurled it at the window, the pane exploding in a cascade of shards that glittered like rain in the storm's light. Security rushed in, 2 burly guards seizing his arms as he thrashed, his screams echoing down the hall. "You'll regret this!" Thunder crashed outside, a deafening boom that swallowed his threats as they dragged him out, his shoes squeaking on the polished floor. Nia stood amid the wreckage, the wind howling through the broken window, her tears mingling with the rain that blew in. The boardroom was hers, but Charles's exit left a chill in her bones. This fight wasn't over. Not yet. The Horizon Airways office in Dallas was a cavern of flickering emergency lights, the storm outside clawing at the building with relentless fury. Nia Thompson sat alone in a leather chair, her silhouette sharp against the stuttering glow, replaying the boardroom victory in her mind. Charles' shattered exit, the vote swinging her way. Her phone buzzed on the desk, Daniel Pierce's name flashing like a warning flare. She answered, her voice steady but tight. "Pierce, what's the holdup?" His reply came cold as ice, cutting through the hum of the storm. "Horizon's pulling out. Charles offered me a better deal." The words hit like a sledgehammer, and Nia's scream tore through the room, raw and echoing off the walls. "You snake!" She gripped the phone, her knuckles whitening as Daniel's voice droned on, clinical and detached. "Charles leaked evidence. Says Apex manipulated Summit's stock. My board spooked. We're done." Nia's knees buckled, and she collapsed into the chair, the device slipping from her hand to clatter on the floor. "Stock manipulation?" she rasped, disbelief choking her. Charles had forged a lie, a desperate counterstrike to fracture her alliance, and Daniel had swallowed it whole. Alone in the dim office, her sob broke free, ragged and unrestrained. "I trusted him." The confession spilled out, a wound torn open. Hours of strategy, handshakes sealed in that smoky boardroom, all dust now. Her chest heaved as she pressed her hands to her face, tears soaking her palms, the sting of betrayal sharper than any airport slight. The door burst open, Marcus Evans barreling in, his breath short and eyes wild. "Nia, we've got the recording. Daniel's bluffing." He thrust a laptop onto the desk, hitting play. Charles's slurred voice crackled through, bragging about Directive X at that club, the same damning tape from the boardroom. "No mention of stock games," Marcus said, his voice a lifeline. Charles faked it, and Daniel's running scared. Nia's head snapped up, her tears glistening in the flickering light, and her defiance roared back, a phoenix clawing from ashes. "I'll win alone if I have to," she snarled, slamming her fist on the desk, the sound a battle cry. Daniel's cowardice crystallized in her mind, a man too afraid of her power to stand firm, buckling under a ghost story Charles had spun. Marcus stepped closer, his hand firm on her shoulder. "We're family, Nia," he said, his deep voice steadying her like an anchor. "He's got nothing on us." The lights flickered one last time, then died, plunging the room into pitch black, the storm's howl filling the void. Nia stood, her silhouette swallowed by darkness, but her resolve burned brighter than ever, a flame no betrayal could snuff out. Her breathing slowed, her mind racing through the wreckage of Daniel's retreat. Marcus's presence was a rock, his loyalty a shield against the chaos. The question gnawed at her. Had Charles outplayed her, his fake evidence a masterstroke to unravel her plans? Or was this her moment to rise, to turn his desperation into her victory? She clenched her fists, the answer surging through her veins like wildfire. "He's bluffing, and I'm calling it," she whispered into the dark. Charles had swung and missed. She'd make sure it was his last move. 6 months had passed, and the Apex Air first-class lounge in Atlanta gleamed like a phoenix risen from ashes, its vibrant hues of teal and gold soaking up the sunlight that streamed through wide, spotless windows. The space was a rebirth. Gone were Summit's drab wood panels and stuffy air, replaced by open curves and sleek tech humming quietly in the background. Nia Thompson walked the polished floor, her steps slow and deliberate, her blazer swapped for a crisp white shirt that caught the light. The airline she'd wrested from Charles's grip was hers now, reshaped in her image. AI had slashed delays by 28%, predictive systems purring like a well-oiled engine. Blind hiring had leveled the playing field, drawing talent Summit had ignored. Keisha Brooks, 40, now a manager with braids swinging as she moved, greeted Nia with a beaming smile, her clipboard clutched like a trophy. "Morning, boss," she said, her voice bright with a pride that hadn't been there before. Charles's last gasp, a frantic lawsuit claiming Nia's takeover was illegal, had collapsed under its own weight, dismissed by a judge who'd seen through his bluster. Word had come that morning. He'd retired, a broken man retreating to lick his wounds. Nia paused by a window, gazing out at the tarmac where Apex planes gleamed in their new livery, white wings streaked with gold, a symbol of ascent. She turned to Keisha, her voice steady but fierce, a blazing fire that warmed the room. "This is ours now," the words rang out, a declaration etched in every corner of the lounge, from the self-check-in kiosks to the staff who moved with purpose, not fear. Summit's domestic ops were dead. Apex Air had risen, a testament to what she'd fought for, bled for, won. Keisha's joy was radiant, spilling over as she stepped closer, her eyes shining. "You gave me my life back, Nia," she said, her voice thick with gratitude, a balm to the scars Nia still carried from that airport humiliation, from Charles's venom. "I was a ghost after they fired me. Broke, scared, hiding those emails like a coward. Now my kids see me stand tall." Her hand brushed Nia's arm, a quiet thank you that hit deeper than words. Nia's pride swelled, her throat tightening as her voice cracked with emotion. "We're not just flying. We're soaring over their hate." She saw it in Keisha's smile, in the diverse faces of the staff. Jerome now a supervisor, Asia leading a crew. Every hire a brick in the wall she'd built against Summit's legacy. Her chest ached with the weight of it, a victory not just for her, but for every soul they'd tried to crush, every dream they'd dismissed. She'd turned their exclusion into a launch pad, and the view from here was breathtaking. A sharp crack split the air, and Nia spun as a wall buckled mid-renovation, plaster crumbling to reveal a stack of old Summit posters, faded ads of smiling white families in first class, relics of the exclusion she'd torched from the airline soul. "Get me a lighter," she said, her voice steel. A staffer handed her one, and she struck the flame, setting the pile ablaze right there on the floor. The fire licked upward, smoke curling as employees cheered, a primal roar of release. The stench of burning paper mingled with the lounge's clean air, a cleansing pyre for the past she'd buried. Then a janitor approached, his brow furrowed, holding a crumpled memo fished from Charles's old office during the cleanup. Nia unfolded it, her eyes narrowing as she read his scrawled confession. Directive X cost us millions. Delays, complaints, lost routes. Kept it for pride. Worth it. Her laugh was bitter, sharp as a blade, cutting through the room. "Your pride bought my airline," she said, crumpling the paper and tossing it into the dying flames. The twist stung. Charles had known his hate was a sinking ship, but clung to it anyway, handing her the keys to his ruin. She watched the memo curl to ash, her victory complete, a fireproof crown on the empire she'd forged. The Apex Air flight from Atlanta to Dallas sliced through a golden sunset, the sky ablaze with streaks of orange and pink that painted the cabin in warm, fleeting light. Nia Thompson stepped aboard, her white shirt crisp against her skin, and settled into a first-class seat, 1B, the very spot she'd been denied months ago. A flight attendant handed her a flute of champagne, bubbles rising like tiny victories, and she cradled it as the plane taxied toward the runway. Her phone buzzed, a news alert flashing across the screen. Charles Rutherford retires amid scandal. She smirked, raising the glass in a silent toast, then tapped out a reply to her sister Lena, 38, whose text popped up next. "Free tickets, sis." Nia's laugh was soft, a ripple of joy as the engines roared to life. She leaned back, the seat's leather cool against her shoulders, and gazed out the window as the plane climbed, the ground shrinking beneath her, a patchwork of lights swallowed by the horizon. "This is for you," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the hum, her thoughts drifting to her parents. Her father's hands, rough from years of mopping floors, flashed in her mind. Her mother's quiet hymns over the kitchen sink echoed in her ears. They'd fought battles she'd never fully know, their struggles the roots of her ascent. The plane tilted upward, a symbol of everything she'd clawed her way to claim, not just a seat, but a sky of her own making. Her triumph was visceral, a pulse pounding through her veins. "They tried to bury me," she whispered, her eyes tracing the clouds. "But I am the sky now." The words carried a weight that filled her chest, a joy so fierce it ached. Every sneer from Lisa, every roar from Charles, every shadow she'd burned away in that lounge, all fuel for this moment. Yet sorrow laced it, a quiet thread for those still fighting, still unseen, their victories unwon. Her phone lit up again. Lena's reply, "You're a legend." The pride in those words grounded her, tethering her to the love that had held her steady through the storm. She pictured Lena's grin, her teasing demand for tickets, and smiled, the champagne cold against her lips. This wasn't just her win, it was theirs, a family forged in resilience. Turbulence jolted the cabin, the plane shuddering as passengers gasped, their hands clutching armrests. Nia didn't flinch. Her smile widened, steady and sure. "I've weathered worse," she said under her breath, the memory of that rain-soaked flight, of Charles's shattered chair, of Daniel's betrayal flashing through her. This was nothing, a ripple against the tempests she'd faced and conquered. The plane steadied, climbing higher, the sunset blazing through the window like a crown. The cabin lights dimmed as the flight leveled off, and Nia closed her eyes, the hum of the engines a lullaby to her restless soul. The screen ahead flickered, then faded to black, bold white text glowing in the silence. "Who decides where you belong?" Nia did. Her voice echoed through the speakers, calm but commanding, a final gift to those watching. "Rise above hate. It's not just a seat, it's a revolution." The words hung there, a challenge and a promise, as the plane soared on, carrying her legacy into the boundless sky.